Welcome to this Death and Afterlife class. This is the third year that I've offered it, and I've really been surprised by the enthusiastic input and response and people coming out and participating in this class. Surprised, but again, not surprised. It's really one of the largest family night classes that we've had, but then not surprised because this is a topic that is very near to where each of us live. We face death of other people, we face the possibility of our own death, and I think it's helpful to have the church's perspective on the questions that arise from that experience. First, I want to go through the syllabus, the schedule for our classes. This is a 4-week sort of mini-mester. Our normal family nights are 8 weeks long, but we just have 4 weeks for this class. And the topics, the subtopics of those sessions are also listed. Cause and cure of death. We're going to be taking a conceptual approach to what death is, where it comes from the Christian perspective. What is the problem of death and what is the solution to death that we have in Jesus Christ? So this is more of a conceptual, theoretical, theological session today. Next week, we get into more, I think probably what most, which is the question of what actually happens to someone when they die from the church's teaching. And session 2 is entitled Dead and Buried, just sort of to catch people's attention, but also to summarize, this is what happens immediately after someone dies. It's what the church calls the intermediate state of the soul, and intermediate because it comes in between our own personal death and the second coming of Christ. So those are the bookends, and we're going to be talking about what happens in between those bookends. The third session is called Resurrection and Judgment, and that is what happens to all of us, living and dead, when Christ comes again, the end of the world. And that will cover what the actual eternal reward and punishment is that the church invites us to or warns us of, respectively. And then finally, session 4, living with death in mind. We're going to talk about, okay, now we've learned what the church says about death and what it says about the afterlife. How then should our lives be shaped by that knowledge? Like what we've learned, how should we apply it to how we live? And how should it change how we live? So dealing with things like grief, dealing with mindfulness of death, how to prepare for death, how to prepare for judgment. Those are our topics. Are there any questions about the schedule? Okay. All right, so we're going to get into our first session, the cause and cure of death. And before we talk about what the church teaches about death theologically, I want to talk about worldly ideas of death, worldly concepts of death. And we're going to contrast this to what the church teaches. First, when most people in the world think about death, they think about it as something natural. Something taken for granted as that's just part of life and part of how life has always worked. That always life has been followed by death. And that's the way things should be, or just plain the way things are, full stop. We have this saying, as certain as death and taxes. we tend to assume that death is just a basic fact of being human and that it has always been that way. Number two, when people think about the afterlife, what happens after death, they sort of have two ideas. Either they think that death is an end of existence, like when your heart stops, when your brain stops working, you just are no longer. You don't exist after that. Or they think of it as a transition from a material to an immaterial existence. So, sort of a spiritualization of the human person. Many modern people simply assume that their biological life is all that there is. That when biological life is over, that's it. They are over. They don't exist after that. These people think of human beings as merely biological, and so they think that things like thought or emotion, will, that these are all just a matter of nerves firing in the brain. Everything's reducible to biological explanations. And so those kind of people would say that death is an end, that that's it, you are no more. Now, the vast majority of people in the world today and throughout the history of the world have believed that there's something more to life than just biological life, okay? There are concepts of afterlife in so many different cultures, in most human cultures. But most of those ideas, especially I'm talking about the non-Christian ideas of death and afterlife, involve a transition to a pure spiritual, eternal reality. Like when you leave the body, your soul goes off and goes to the better place where souls are, and that's the end of the story, right? Most people, I think, would think that way. In fact, most Christians, if you ask them, sort of conceptualize the afterlife in those terms. That your soul leaves your body, you leave this material world behind, and that you as a person will no longer have any need for material existence. Okay? So, an end or a spiritualization of the human person. People have different ideas of what this pure spiritual state is like, and it depends on mostly what they think they would enjoy to do for eternity. Whether it be, reunion with loved ones, or doing their favorite hobby or their favorite sport, or even the tranquil emptiness of Hinduism. But this conception of a pure spiritual state of happiness. And these ideas are not necessarily exclusive, because I think some people, a lot of people in America today, really have deep doubts about there being anything beyond the biological. They have a hard time sort of convincing themselves that there is something beyond biological life. And so they have this deep-seated fear that they will end when they die, while at the same time they sort of speak the words of reassurance to themselves and to others about trying to make themselves believe, kind of wishful thinking about the afterlife. The third worldly idea about death and afterlife, how most people think about death, is that they don't, actually. They don't think about death. In our world, we try to ignore death. We try to minimize death, pretend it isn't going to happen. And this leads to risk-taking behavior. People sort of subconsciously think of themselves as immortal, and so they take huge risks to their life, not even considering the possibility that it could end their life. It leads to wasteful life choices. People have goals in life, pursuits in life, that don't take into account the reality of death. An example of that is found in the Gospel of Luke, You have this quote on your handout. And it's a parable that Jesus told. And Jesus told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.'" So this rich man didn't even consider the possibility that his life could end. He just saw a continual progress. More and more crops, filling up larger and larger barns. But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So there's a problem with not taking into account the reality of death when we set goals for our life, when we plan out our life and shape our values. And then also we can see this ignoring, minimization of death in modern funeral services. A lot of modern funeral services, you couldn't even tell that it's a funeral if you sort of just walked in off the street and no one told you what was going on, because they're shaped as or themed as celebrations of life. Oftentimes there's not even a body there or a casket. There's sort of pictures and slideshows and memories of someone's life. And if you were a stranger walking in off the street, you might imagine to see the person sort of sitting in the front row being toasted by this group. And that's because we want to pretend like death isn't a reality even when someone has died. So people tend not to think about death. And then finally, and this is paradoxical given what we just said about people trying to ignore death, people generally fear death. Underneath all of that ignoring, wishful thinking, trying to brush it off as just natural, it's just a part of life, is this deep, deep-seated fear of death. And the more that it's repressed, the more problems that it leads to, like anxiety disorders and depression and really a loss of a sense of self. So these are sort of what I categorize as the worldly concept of death and the afterlife. And all of these ideas and attitudes, you'll find as we continue through this class, are contrary to the church's teaching about death and the afterlife. The gospel provides a completely different perspective that changes our ideas and attitudes, and in so doing, it provides a basis for coping with death in a positive and constructive way. To this point, this idea that death is natural, today we're going to talk about that, about how death is not something that God originally intended when He created the world, and He in fact did not create the world to be subject to death. That came in another way after creation. Okay? With regard to the afterlife as being an end, obviously we don't believe that because we believe in an afterlife. But even this idea of the afterlife as a transition to a pure, spiritual, immaterial, eternal state, we actually don't believe that either, because we believe the body has a role to play in the afterlife. We're going to talk about that in sessions 2 and 3. And then finally, in our fourth and final session, we're going to be talking about how we shouldn't ignore and minimize death. We should face that reality and learn how to face it in a positive and constructive way. And finally, why we don't need to fear death. So, according to the Scriptures, God did not create the world for death. In fact, He created no place for death in the world. He created the world to live. God did not intend for death to be a part of human experience. He did not create death. And so, from the Christian perspective, death is not natural. It is not part of the human nature that God created. You have a quote from the Wisdom of Solomon. And he says very plainly, God did not make death. Neither does He have pleasure over the destruction of the living. But the ungodly summoned death by their words and works. Although they thought death would be a friend, they were dissolved, for they made a covenant with death, since they were deserving to share it in common. For God created man for immortality and made him an image of His own eternity. But death entered the world by the envy of the devil, and those of his portion tempted. It's interesting what he says about humanity inviting death. And it sounds crazy. And it is crazy. But it's true. We're going to talk about how humanity invited death into our lives and how we succumbed to the temptation of the devil and accepted his gift of death. But going back to the original point, in the Wisdom of Solomon, God did not make death. Adam and Eve were created for immortality, but that immortality was only possible if they maintained their connection to God, who is the source of life. God created humanity with the potential for immortality. Not a guarantee of immortality, but with the potential for immortality, because we have the potential for union with God, who is the source of life. In the Gospel of John, Christ says that even as the Father has life in Himself, so He has given the Son to have life in Himself. There is a quality of God that He is a source of life, a generator of life. He has life within Himself. Now, we as human beings don't have life within ourselves. We were created to be able to receive the power of life from God, like some machine that's plugged into the outlet in the wall, a lamp. As long as the lamp is plugged into the wall, electricity flows through it and the light shines. But when you unplug the lamp, the light goes out. It's the same way with how we were created to draw upon God as the source of life. And as long as we stayed plugged in to the source of life, we had life flowing through us. So man was created for immortality. The world was created, in fact, with the potential for deathlessness. So another thing we learn from the Scriptures about how God created the world is that He created human beings as having two parts, a dual nature, one living being with two parts. God created man with both a physical and a spiritual aspect, both a body and a soul. So in Genesis chapter 2, when the creation of Adam is described, it says that God formed man from the dust of the ground, sort of like a sculptor. He pulled together the earth, the clay, and formed the human body. But at that point, it was nothing more than a statue, right? A lifeless statue, something formed out of the things of this earth. But then He breathed the breath of life into it. He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. And that breath of life breathed into him is representative of that spiritual part of the human person, the immaterial part of the human person, the soul. And it is this union of soul and body that make the man a living being. As Orthodox Christians, based on this, we believe that both the soul and the body are essential to the human person, essential parts of the human person. Both were created in the image and likeness of God. And this is a little bit different idea than other theologies teach. A lot of people think of the soul as being the part of the human being that's created in the image and likeness of God, the sort of divine or quasi-divine part of the human person. But as Orthodox Christians, we believe that both the human soul and the human body are somehow created in the image and likeness of God. They share in that image and likeness. We also believe that a body without a soul is not a human person. And in the same way, the soul without the body is not a human person. Now, the first part most people would agree with. You know, a body without the soul, that's just earth and dust. But we also believe that the soul without the body is not a complete human person. It is lacking, it is deficient. And that's different from how a lot of people conceive of the human person. It has a huge impact on our understanding of the afterlife. St. Methodius of Olympus, you have this quote in front of you. He writes that man with respect to his nature is most truly said to be neither soul without body, nor on the other hand body without soul, but a being composed of the union of both body and soul into one form of the beautiful. And it's wonderful how he says that. Basically, he's saying that the soul without the body without the soul, neither are beautiful. That it's the union of the soul and the body together that God has created to be beautiful. Okay, and St. Gregory Palamas writes this: when God is said to have made man according to his image, the word man, so the thing that is created in the image of God, means neither the soul by itself nor the body by itself, but the two together. Now, we're going to get into the implications of this idea more next week. But for today, I might point out one of those implications, which is that this principle of the human being being dual in nature and the essential union of soul and body being the human person, that this rules out any kind of belief in reincarnation in the Orthodox Church. Because reincarnation is the idea that there's this soul that's sort of hopping from body to body, right? And so it goes through multiple bodies, and none of those bodies is sort of like specially significant to that soul. The Christian idea is that my body is my body, and my soul could never know another body. My soul and my body, they go together in a way that is unique and irreplaceable. So, as Orthodox Christians, hopefully you already know that we don't believe in reincarnation, but this is why we can't even believe in reincarnation. It violates our anthropology, our understanding of the human person. Now we're going to talk about how death came into the picture, but before we do that, are there any questions about what we've talked about so far, or about these two principles of creation? Don't be shy because of the microphones. It's okay. Somebody has to be first. Okay, Karen, be first. But you need it for the recording.
So when you talk about the soul and the body, can you also mention how that relates to the Orthodox view of cremation?
Yeah. So this also has an impact on our prohibition in the Orthodox Church on cremation. And I was going to talk about this in another session, but I can talk about it now. That's fine. No, it's good, since it's come up. And that is a really big question that people have. So cremation was used in ancient times, especially, by pagan religious cultures that did not think that the material world was good. In fact, many of them, they had a dualist understanding of the world where material things, like the physical world, was evil. It was always negative, and the spiritual world was always good. So immaterial was good, and material was bad. And so along those lines, they would think of the body as something that the soul needed to escape from. Like the body was a burden, the body was dragging the soul down, preventing the soul from reaching its full potential. And so in these pagan cultures, they would see the body as something negative. And that's why they practiced cremation, because their idea was when a person died and their soul left their body, that they were sort of relieved. And what was left was just the trash, right? And so what you do with the trash is you burn the trash up so it doesn't take up any space. You don't give any special significance to what is left over when what you're focused on is the soul sort of escaping into this pure spiritual reality and having no more need for the body. Also, you can really think about it, cremation in those cultures was maybe even celebrated as kind of symbolizing that release of the person from the bonds of the body. Like the body is burned up and you see the smoke going up and you think, oh, that's like their soul that's escaping into the spiritual realm from this evil material realm. Well, as Christians, we don't believe that. We don't believe that premise. We don't believe that the world is essentially evil, that the material world is essentially evil. In fact, we believe the opposite, because in Genesis chapter 1, when God creates the world, after every step of creation, he says, and it was good, right? So God creates he creates light, and it was good. And he creates the sun and the moon, and it was good. And he creates the sky, and it was good. And the water, and it was good. And the animals, and it was good. Good, 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 good. Until finally on the sixth day, God creates man, and lo, it is very good. So the world is created essentially as good. The material world is created essentially as good. Now, when we look around us, there's a lot of bad things in the world. And that's what we're about to get to, is how the bad things come into the world. But essentially, the world is good, and we celebrate that the world is good, and we want the world to reach its good potential. So we have a good understanding or a good valuation of the material world. And then on top of that, as I just said, we believe that when God created man, he created man as an essential union of body and soul. So both body and soul are essential to the human person. Both of them are equally important. And so when a person's soul is separated from their body, the body is not sort of leftover trash just to be disposed of in the incinerator. Now, in modern times, there are other reasons why people practice cremation. And, some of them make a lot of sense. For example, people practice cremation because of the expense that goes along with interment, with burial in the ground. Now, burial in the ground doesn't have to be that expensive. We make it expensive because of all the bells and whistles that the funeral industry sells to us that we buy into. But even if we accept this argument that cremation is a cheaper route, and that is, something that people have to think about, still as Christians, we see such an important statement of the value that we have in this body created in the image and likeness of God through the funeral act of bringing the body into the church and then carrying it to its last resting place, and then planting it in the earth with the hope of the body being raised again when Christ comes again. So there's this whole symbolic message in earth burial that is so significant to us as Christians, and that's why cremation is prohibited in the Orthodox Church. Now, there are exceptions that have been made in the Orthodox Church in very extreme cases, okay? And so one is Orthodox Christians who die in Japan. Legally, the government requires them to be cremated because they're running out of land in Japan. I mean, Japan is so crowded that they don't have room for, or they, at least the government doesn't feel that they have room for people to be buried in the ground. So legally, everyone is required for their loved ones to be cremated in Japan. And so Orthodox Christians who die in Japan, they have to be cremated. It's a legal requirement. And so the Orthodox Church accepts that. There are times when, like, there's some plague or a huge battle where there has been just such a number of dead bodies that it was not reasonable to think that you could bury all of those bodies in enough time to prevent sickness from spreading. And so for a very practical reason, the church was kind of pushed against its will to accept cremation. Again, not endorsing the symbolism that has so often been attached to that act, but seeing the practical necessity. Now, we do not believe that someone being cremated in any way affects their, whether or not they can be resurrected or whether or not they can go to heaven or anything like that. It doesn't. Really, the significance of it is our making a statement that the human body is sacred. Really. That's in the final judgment. Does that answer the question? Are there any follow-up questions about that? Yes. Microphone.
So you're saying that it's not that if the body is destroyed, it's not that the person's spirit or whatever is destroyed. It's just more of the symbology of the sacredness of the human person.
Right.
It's why we preserve the body. But if the body is incinerated for some reason, or people have been dying for thousands of years, and there's people who were buried and their bodies are no longer there just because nature's destroyed it.
A very recent example that sticks out in all of our memories is 9/11. And there were victims of 9/11 who there are no remains of them because they were vaporized. Not by any choice of their own. And so obviously, we can't criticize them for that. We don't criticize them for that. The point is not that cremation per se is wrong. It's the symbolic, that it's a symbol it's a symbol of a false teaching. It's the symbol of a falsehood that the human body is not significant or important or sacred. So, yeah. Good. Yeah. Jan?
About the reuniting of the body and the soul, is that symbolic?
No, it's literal. We're going to talk about that in session 3. But the resurrection of the dead when Christ comes again is a literal event, a future historical event that we are anticipating. We don't know when it will happen, but we do believe that it is something that will actually happen. And we'll talk about that more in session 3 and explain what that is and what that means. Any other, follow-up questions? Yeah.
What about organ donation?
Organ donation. Mm-hmm. Well, again, so when we talked about cremation, we said it wasn't merely the act of the body being burned up that was wrong, but the symbolism of the choice that I want to be cremated, because that choice reflects a wrong attitude about the body. So when you want this, and now there hasn't been a definitive statement on this issue from the Orthodox Church as there is on cremation. I mean, cremation is, that teaching is clear. On organ donation, there is not like one official teaching that has been put forth on that. But my reasoning is, what does that act symbolize? It symbolizes the giving of yourself to someone else so that their quality of life can be enhanced, or maybe that they can actually add more years to their life. And then what if, during those years they do, great good for other people? Or what if those are the years they need in order to repent and come to God and be prepared for eternal life? I mean, so to me, organ donation is something positive, and we don't have to be afraid like that if I don't have my lungs, then in the resurrection I won't have lungs, so what am I going to do? You know what I mean? Like, God can figure that out. God can figure that out, and so we don't have to worry about that. Other? Yes?
The place, how about where you were buried? I mean, does it make any difference what part of the world with your spouses, families, and things like that?
Oh, where you're buried, or if you're buried near your loved ones,
yes.
It doesn't matter, because when everyone's raised, we'll all come to the same place. Anyone else? Okay, good. And we might come back to these questions in session 2 or session 3, so you'll have another opportunity to ask about this these and related topics. All right, so we just talked about how God created the world in the beginning, like God's original plan for the world, and how he created human nature in its pristine origin. But the message of the book of Genesis is that reality, that state didn't exist for very long. Because right after humanity is created, man and woman, Adam and Eve, are created in chapter 2 of Genesis. In chapter 3 of Genesis, they fall into sin and death through the temptation of the devil. God created humanity in his image and likeness with freedom. Because God has this freedom to be who he is, not to be constrained by any kind of necessity. And we have the potential to be like God in that sense of freedom. And in order to make that freedom real, and in order to give us the actual freedom to either choose God or not choose God, he gave us a very simple test. And that's the whole point of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the forbidden fruit. God, when he created Adam and Eve, he told them, look, there's this tree in the middle of the garden. You can eat the fruit from all of the other trees and plants in the garden, but this one tree don't eat. Now, there's nothing magical or special about that tree except that God said, don't eat from it. So he could have very easily have said, like, in the middle of the garden, there's this button, don't push it. I mean, that's all. There's this button, don't push it. Okay? But the devil came in the form of the serpent, and he tempted Eve, and she took of the fruit. Now, it's called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why is it called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? It's not like there was some kind of download, when she ate the fruit, like she got like this mental download and she understood what good and evil was through some kind of cognitive process. What happened was she knew evil because she just did evil, like she experienced evil. Because she just did it. She did something wrong, and so now she knows what wrong is and what it's like to do something wrong. See what I'm saying? Before then, when she had only done good, she only knew good because she had only practiced good. When she chose to defy God, to push the button, to eat the fruit, she did something evil, and now she knew what it was like to do something evil. And of course, she gave it to Adam, and he followed right along, eating of the fruit and really making that choice not just for himself, but for all of humanity, because he is the head of humanity, represents us, and his decisions and Eve's decisions and the decisions of all of the generations to sort of follow in his footsteps affect us down to this day. Now, God warned Adam and Eve when he told them not to eat the fruit from that tree. In whatever day you eat from it, you shall die by death. You shall die by death. Of course, they didn't know what death was, but it must have sounded pretty ominous when God says, not just you will die, but you will die by death. And this is what happened when they sinned. Now, we conceive of this as being a punishment, right? Adam and Eve defied God, and so God sentenced them to death. And that's sort of how it's related in the book of Genesis. But really, theologically, even though we accept that that is how humanity experiences the reality of death, it's not an arbitrary punishment that God meted out on the human race after they sinned. It's not punishment in the sense that we think of punishment, like a judge who sits there and mulls over the facts and decides, okay, this is what you deserve, and so I'm going to give it to you. It's the simple reality of the lamp being unplugged from the wall. So, when Adam and Eve sinned, they decided, I'm not going to do it God's way, I'm going to do it my way. They turned their back on God, they unplugged themselves from God, they decide to go it on their own, and so they reap the consequences of that choice. Consequences that were unforeseen by them, okay, maybe, because they were ignoring God's warning, because God warned them ahead of time, when you eat of this fruit, when you defy me, you will die by death. St. Paul talks about this reality of death being the consequence to sin in Romans chapter 6, verse 23. You have that quote in front of you. He says, the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. And this word wages is, in Greek, a word picture. What it refers to is the provisions that a commander gives to his soldiers. And really, it more precisely refers not to money, but to food. Like the commanding officer commands a distribution of food to his people. So he takes care of those who follow him, and he gives them their provisions. And there's a real irony there that St. Paul would choose that word. Because what he's saying is actually the same thing that the wisdom of Solomon was saying. He's saying that if you decide to leave God's camp and enter into the devil's camp, if you de-enlist from God's army and you enlist in the devil's army, these are the provisions that he gives you. If you stay with God, he gives you life. He gives a daily distribution of life, so to speak, to his army. When you enter the devil's camp, he gives a daily distribution of death for those who follow him through sin. Now, as I said, we think of this as punishment because we experience it as punishment. But in reality, it is a natural consequence. Now, when I say this, I have to immediately make a clarification, because some people might jump to the conclusion, well, Father Jeremy is saying that everyone who dies deserves it because of something that they did. And that's not what I'm saying. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Because we know of at least relatively good people who have died, but we also know of innocent children who haven't even had an opportunity to do anything wrong, who have died, maybe even in the womb. So obviously there's no sin that they have done that they could receive sin, or they could receive death in exchange for that sin. What I'm saying is that death comes into the human race, comes into the human experience as a result of human sin. That all death is ultimately in this world because of sin. Because, first of all, because Adam and Eve sinned in the beginning. It brought death into the world. And because generation after generation has sinned, that brings death into the world. And sometimes people die as a result of other people's sins. Very clearly, we can see that. I mean, very clearly, obviously, if someone commits murder, they've caused, through their sin, the death of another person. More indirectly, imagine someone who smokes heavily, like smokes cigarettes heavily in like enclosed space with their children for year after year, and through the secondhand smoke, their children eventually get lung cancer and die. Or imagine that some company discovers, like, let's say GM. I mean, that's an example closer to today. GM had the problem with aren't they the car company that had the problem recently with the ignition switches? And they got in trouble not just because of the problem, but because it was covered up. The notification was delayed, and people died. Well, people died as a result of the sins of individuals in that company. We also have clear examples of death being the result of our own choices. Like I said, we make poor health choices, and it can hasten our death, whether it be through our diet or our inactivity, lack of exercise, or through risk-taking behavior of other kinds. So our actions can lead to our death very directly and clearly. It can lead to other people's death very directly and clearly. But beyond that, there is this larger sense in which death is in the world because of the cumulative weight of human sin throughout history. Are there any questions about that? Let's get the microphone to David. Where is it? Hold on. Okay. It takes a second for it to come.
It raises the question, because you said the world thinks of death as natural, and you said we as Orthodox Christians don't believe that. However, you just said death is natural.
Well, I
said...
Yeah, go ahead.
Make sure I'm clear, because of sin of man, because no one's ever lived without sin. Is that what you're saying? It's natural that we as humans are going to sin, so it's natural that we're going to die.
Well, we have two different definitions of the word natural being
Okay.
used here. And so I'll
Okay.
clarify.
Okay.
When we talk about natural, especially from a theological sense, natural means the essence of something as it is in itself. Like we're talking about the essential nature of a thing. Not what's happened to it since it is created or was created, but how it was originally created by God. Or when we talk about God's nature, that is Him as He is in Himself. Now, when you say natural, what you mean is that it is a part of reality as we know it today, right? But all of that is post-Adam's sin. That's post-original sin.
So your first definition of natural is the way God intended for us to be.
And how God created us originally, how Adam and
Created
Eve
us.
were in the garden before they
So
sinned.
the second definition of natural is what really happens.
Exactly. That's, we could say, an existential definition of natural as opposed to ontological would be, I think, the technical term for my definition of something as it is in itself. But what that also means is, when we say that, we mean that human nature is still intact within us. Like there is still that potential that God placed in us to be immortal, to be utterly free, where we are not in any way constrained by sin or by the passions or by all the things that constrain and control us today. That nature is still within us, even though we've disfigured and marred it and muddied it and pulled it apart. But deep within us, there is still that potential that has not been lost. So it's not a transformation where we've lost that essential gift that God's given us, but our experience of reality is that we aren't able by ourselves to get back to that. That's why Christ came and saved us. So. It's time for our break. Family nights, for those of you who this is your first family night, we have a 10-minute break at 8 o'clock, so you can go into the hall and get refreshments, and then when it's announced, come back in here and we'll finish up our session for tonight. All right, let's continue. We talked about how death is a result of sin, and Al has a question. Okay, Al.
When we're talking about original sin and Adam and Eve, why did God allow them to be tempted if He knew how they were going to respond?
Mm-hmm. Why did God allow them to be tempted? That's good. So it goes back to what I originally said about God giving us the gift of freedom as a part of being created in His image. And if you're going to have freedom, you have to have the freedom to make one choice or the other choice, right? If I say you have the freedom to not eat this fruit or to not eat this fruit, that's not freedom. You have to have two different options in order for it to be actually free. And really, the essential question, as I said before the break, is not the eating of the fruit. That's not the essential matter. But you have a freedom to do things God's way or to do things not God's way, which is your own way. Now, the benefit to that, well, the downside of that we already know. The downside of that is that humanity made the wrong choice and we've been living the consequences ever since. The benefit of that is that it creates the potential for a real relationship. It creates the potential for real love. Because real love, a real relationship requires freedom. It requires the freedom of the person to choose you or to not choose you. And so God gives us the freedom to love Him or to not love And we have to have the freedom to not love him in order to have the freedom to love him. So, am I getting to, is it making sense? Okay. And then, of course, God didn't just know that part of the story. Like, he knew when he created us, he knew that we would sin, but he also knew that he would send his son to redeem us from our sins and create the possibility for us to again return to that free relationship of love with God. So there is still that potential. Now, some people aren't going to make that choice even after Christ has come and saved us and given us, the human race, a second chance. But some people will. And for God, giving us the opportunity was worth the downside. Other questions from what we've talked about so far? All right. So now when I talk about death, I think most of us are thinking about physical death. But those of you who have read the book of Genesis will remember that Adam, after he sinned, he lived for 900 years. So, was God lying when he said, after you eat the fruit, you will die the death? Actually, let's remember God's words exactly as they are. Oh no, now I've got my pages mixed up. But God said that in the day when you eat of it, you don't have it on your page, I have it on mine. He says, in whatever day you eat from it, immediately you will die by death. So, was God lying? No. Because when we talk about death, from a biblical point of view and in Christian theology, physical death is sort of almost an afterthought to what we mean by the word death. Oh, these are brand new. Good grief. Because first and foremost, death is a spiritual reality. When Adam and Eve sinned, in that day they died by spiritual death. And we use this idea of spiritual death actually just when we talk in everyday speech. We might say that, oh, when such and such happened, I died a little bit inside, right? Life is a lot more than just heartbeats and brain waves. There are a lot of people whose hearts are beating and their brains are working, but they're in a living death because of their spiritual emptiness, right? Lack of meaning, lack of a sense of purpose can leave us feeling dead inside, even though we have all of the outward signs of life from a biological perspective. It is spiritual fulfillment, spiritual life, that makes life worth living. And what happens when we sin, as I talked about before the break, when we turn our backs on God, when we unplug ourselves from God, spiritually, our spirits are the first thing that dies. We lose our connection with God, and as a result, we lose our sense of meaning, our sense of purpose, our understanding of reality. All of these things which flowed from God in the beginning and filled human life with divine content. So spiritual death is the first thing that happens, and spiritual death, if we want to give a short definition, spiritual death is separation of the human soul from God. Separation from God. Spiritual death leads to other kinds of death. Again, not physical death. Social death. The death of society. The inability of people to be kind to other people. To work well with others. Society falls apart as a result of sin. And we can just sort of turn on the local news each day to see the signs of that. That's a sign of spiritual death working its way out, the consequences of spiritual death and separation from God that we see in society. But even within us, there's also emotional death. All of our emotions, our mood comes out of harmony, it goes out of whack. Because of our separation from God, because of the lack of a sense of meaning and a fulfillment that comes from that relationship, then we have things like depression or anxiety, or even emotional numbness. I mean, all of these sort of emotional disorders ultimately come as a result of separation from God and the ramifications of that within our lives. We have intellectual death, the death of the mind, the inability to understand what this world is all about. And you might say, well, you know, we have intellectual progress, right? Science is discovering all kinds of dividing molecules into atoms and dividing those into, further into subatomic particles and quarks and et cetera. And we are discovering more and more things each day. But the more we discovered in terms of the minutia of this universe, the less we know about, like, the things that really matter. The less we understand about even things like death and why there is death and what death is. We have moral death, which is the death of the conscience. The loss of the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, which would have originally flowed from the spiritual life that we had coming from God when we were plugged into God before sin. I mean, that would have been natural to us to distinguish between right and wrong. But now we can't. And then finally, in the end, we have physical death. But physical death, not just in the limited sense of, our hearts stopping and our brains stopping, but the slow death that we experience from birth. Right? The deterioration that our bodies go through all of our lives. The fact of sickness, the church fathers tell us, is a result of human sin, like the sum total of human sin throughout history, is what has brought sickness into the human experience. So physical death, the deterioration of our bodies. And when we think about all these different kinds of death, we have another word that is equivalent, which is corruption. That's the sort of theological word for this process of death working itself out in all of the different aspects of human life, or decay, deterioration. It's things falling apart from the good order that God originally intended and the good order that God originally created. So another way to understand death is that when God created the world, He created it with perfect order and harmony and beauty and everything worked the way it was supposed to, within our personalities, within our moods and our emotions, and our understanding of life and our morality and our bodies. Everything had this harmony that God created it with. God created it, and behold, he said it was very good. But when humanity sins and turns away from God, removes ourselves, and by implication our world, from God's care, then all of that begins to deteriorate. God's power, which didn't just create that original order, but preserved that original order and fueled that ongoing order and harmony, when that's withdrawn, everything, sort of like a process of entropy, it starts to fall apart and deteriorate. And that's what we see in all of these different areas: society falling apart, our emotions, our intellect, our morals, and our bodies, all just deteriorating from the good order that God had originally established for them. And so, in the end, what we see is that spiritual death, which is the most significant kind of death, the fundamental, original kind of death, spiritual death leads to a dead life, which ends with physical death. Spiritual death leads to a dead life that ends in physical death. Are there any questions about that idea of death, that concept of death? Or about anything we've talked about so far? Okay. What we are concerned about, even though death has a much larger meaning, and it's important that we have that background, of course, in this class we are first and foremost concerned with physical death, and that's what we're mainly going to be talking about. Physical death, in the ultimate final sense, is the failure of the body's biological life, and as a result, the separation of the soul from the body. So the classic Christian definition of death is the separation of the soul from the body. All right? The body that was made from the dust, when it's separated from the soul that gives it life, it starts to deteriorate. It decomposes. It returns to the dust. And when this happens, God, in his mercy, prevents the soul also from deteriorating. Because there is no natural immortality of the soul. God alone is naturally immortal. But God, in his good providence, he takes the soul and he keeps it in a place or a state of waiting until Christ comes again and the general resurrection happens. Now that sort of waiting space, that in-between time between death and Christ's second coming, we're going to talk about that next week. But it's important that I say here, because immediately some minds are going to be thinking, that sounds like purgatory, Father, and we don't believe in purgatory. And that's true, we don't believe in purgatory. And we're going to talk more about this next week. But when your mind jumps to the idea of purgatory, there's two reasons for that. One is that you might not clearly understand what the Catholic Church means by purgatory, because it's more than just a waiting place. People kind of have this vague idea of what purgatory means. We'll talk about that more next week, about what the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, teaches about purgatory. And then the other side is, you may not have a clear understanding of what the Orthodox Church teaches about the afterlife, and that's, of course, why you're taking this course, so I'm glad you're here. But just suffice it to say, don't go home and tell your friends and family that, Father Jeremy told us we believe in purgatory. We don't believe in purgatory. And you'll find out why next week. But we do believe that the soul when it's separated from the body, goes into a state of waiting that's called the intermediate state of the soul. And it's preserved there by God until such time as it is reunited to the body in the general resurrection that happens when Christ comes again at the end of time. Now, again, and we're going to keep coming back to this session after session, but it's important to bear in mind what we talked about earlier when we talk about the soul separating from the body, okay? The soul separating from the body, that's not the human person being liberated from the body, right? A human person is a soul and a body together. So when they're separated, that is an unnatural state. That is not what God intended. It is not even something that makes sense from an intellectual point of view. If your basis, your premise is the Bible's teaching about the human person being a soul and a body united. The separation of the soul and body is an unnatural state for the human being. And so Father Lazar Puhalo, you have this quote on your page, he says that in death the soul tears itself away from the body with regret. It's not a liberation, it's a sad thing. Not as from a separate object or a container, not just an earth suit, but as from its own self, from a part of its own being. So death is a sad thing. Of course we mourn death as a sad thing, but it's a sad thing even for the dead person. Now, there's a Christian hope, a greater Christian hope that turns that sadness into joy, but we have to first and foremost recognize that this is a tragedy. Even in the case when the person is, a saint and they go to live with God, that tragedy is transformed into joy, but there is some element of it, the fact that this body has been separated from its soul and that it is deteriorating in the ground, that is a tragedy. Just like that hymn that we have in the funeral service, I weep and I wail when I think on death, and imagine our beauty, fashioned in the image of God, lying in the grave, disfigured, dishonored, and bereft of form, decomposing. So it is a tragedy, and we have to keep that in mind. So that's how death came into the world. God did not create it. Human beings brought death into the world by our bad choices, through our sins. The human race, through sin, brought death into the world. But even though God did not create death, even though He didn't intend for it to happen, as we talked about earlier, He knew that it was going to happen, because He knew everything that was going to happen before He created anything. And He allowed death to happen because He knew that He could redirect it to a good purpose. So theologically, we don't believe that God causes everything that happens, but we do believe that even those things that God doesn't cause, He allows. So God doesn't cause the bad things. He only causes good things. But the bad things that happen, even those things are allowed by God. And they are allowed by God because He knows providentially that they can be brought to a good purpose. So even death, God has redirected to a good purpose. First of all, making an end to sin. Making an end to sin. Physical death prevents us from adding sin to sin eternally without limit. So if we did not have physical death, we could instead, for eternity, continue the downward spiral of spiritual, social, emotional, intellectual, and moral death. Can you imagine if sinners had the opportunity to live eternally, continually falling deeper and deeper into this spiritual abyss of negativity. Physical death limits the amount of time that we have an opportunity to sin in. And so St. Gregory the theologian, and again you have this quote on your handout, he writes, "Man gains something even in this. Death interrupts sin so that evil is not made eternal. Thus the punishment became a philanthropy, a benevolence. For I am convinced that it is in this way that God punishes." And I love this last sentence. I am convinced that it is in this way that God punishes. So all those ways in which we think that God punishes sin, St. Gregory says, well, that's not really the full story, and that's a distorted idea of what God's doing. Whenever God punishes, He is actually punishing us for our benefit. That those harsh consequences that we experience as a result of our bad choices, that those, God allows them because He knows that they can help us. Not merely as a punishment because, He feels like we deserve it, but rather because even the punishment itself is a philanthropy, St. Gregory says, because of the good results it can bring. Death, in this sense, is a hard blessing. See, we like the soft blessings. We like the warm fuzzies and all of the, pleasant things that God blesses us with from time to time. But there are these hard blessings that we should also thank God for. Physical death keeps us from an unlimited downward spiral of spiritual death and corruption, leading not just to greater depravity, but also to greater pain, sadness, and suffering. And so, a theologian, Nikolaos Vasiliadis, says, "Thus, sinful man will not remain eternally a living corpse because of his separation from God, the source of life." Because even if we could live forever in this life, we would be living forever as, he says, a living corpse. If we want some kind of eternal life that is worth living, we first need to exit out of this living death. So that's the first of the benefits that God brings through death, that He's transformed death into a blessing. The second is curbing pride. Okay, Gail.
In other words, God created us immortal. God created us with immortality in us, not the same as His, but we would have gone on living in corruption.
No.
No?
No. So no, you're misunderstanding.
If He had not allowed death?
If He had not allowed death.
Okay.
That's a theoretical question because, death is just a part of, death is a reality. So, but if we imagine a world in which, hypothetically, God would have sort of let us off the hook and sort of let us continue to live physically even while we were dying in all these other ways, then that would have been the result.
So then it would also be theoretical if you thought that we would have just continued in this corruption until we reached a point where we had just returned to the nothing from which we had been made, sort of like Nietzsche's idea of...
Yeah, we can sort of speculate about that, yeah.
Okay, but that's not Orthodox theology. That's kind of speculation.
It's just speculation, yeah. Yeah, we're trying to understand a fact that exists. It's not that there are sort of alternate realities, but we're just trying to understand a fact that exists by sort of contemplating what might have been the reality in the absence of this fact, which is that death, including physical death, is the result of turning away from God. Okay, good. Any other questions? All right. So another benefit is the curbing of pride. Because pride and arrogance are the root of all sin. Like, all sin can actually be described as an act of pride, an act of rebellion against God, and of putting ourselves sort of above God, or making ourselves another God besides God. If you sort of recognize as the premise that God created us, and that He, in creating us, also has a right to tell us how to use this life that He has given us, and that He is the one who really understands how life works and what makes for the best life and what keeps life going, as well as the opposite, what would destroy life and cause its disintegration and cause unhappiness and pain, that we should listen to Him and do whatever He says. Well, when we don't listen to Him and do whatever He says, what we're saying is, I know better than God, and therefore what we're saying is, I can be my own God. Do you follow me in that progression of thought? And really that's what Eve was doing when she took the fruit and ate it. When she was tempted by the devil, by the serpent, he said to her in his temptation, if you eat this fruit, first of all, he just gave a blatant lie. He said, you will not die. Okay. Hitler had this theory of the big lie. He says, if you tell people a big lie with a bunch of little truths, then they'll swallow it a lot easier than telling them a little lie. So Satan was the original proponent of that theory. So he tells this big lie, Eve, you won't die, but what will happen to you? You will become like God, he says. If you eat this fruit, you're not going to die, but you're going to become like God. You're going to know good and evil like God. Well, again, he's lying there, because you won't know good and evil in the same way God knows them from an objective point of view. You'll know them from the subjective point of view that you will have experienced evil. Like God only knows evil from the objective point of view. He knows what evil is and he understands it, but he has no experience of it. But humanity, when Eve took the fruit, when Adam took the fruit, they came to know evil by experience, which is different from God's knowledge, right? So Satan gives this promise, when you eat the fruit, you will become like God. That's the temptation, and that's the ultimate temptation that we experience in all of the areas of our lives, is that you can play God in your life, and you can play God in the lives of other people, and you can, for example, fix your own problems with your own solutions, ignoring God and what He tells us. That you can fix other people's problems with your own solutions. That you can run the world better than God or other people. That you can run your family better than God or other people. You can run your relationships better than God or other people. So at the root of every temptation, and therefore at the root of every sin, is this proud thought of putting ourselves in the place of God. Choosing to go our own way, and trying to be masters of our own destiny. Now, the awareness of mortality undermines this pride. I mean, if we open our eyes and really keep in mind the reality of our own mortality, it causes us to recognize and admit our smallness in a way that, very few things will do. When we recognize, okay, I can try to do good things and try to benefit this church and build good, programs and activities and events in this church, but I always have to recognize, yeah, but tomorrow I could be hit by a Mack truck, and then it'll be up to other people and ultimately God to continue this work. So, I mean, death faces us with the fact that we are not God. Did you have a question? Microphone.
So I know that we've talked about that when Eve pushed the button right of the apple, that's when death came into being. Did it exist when Lucifer fell?
Well, spiritual death.
So there was spiritual death when Lucifer fell, yes?
Yeah.
So would that have been the first? Is that kind of when death came into
Yeah.
being, yes?
Yeah. Of course, not physical death because the angels are not physical. But before the creation of humanity was the creation of the immaterial world, the angelic world. And we are taught that at a certain point before Adam and Eve, that some of the angels rebelled against God and exercised their freedom in order to choose to go their own way. And they experienced spiritual death, but only spiritual death because they are only spiritual beings. Okay. All right, and the final benefit that I want to talk about is the transformation of the body through decay. Transformation through decay. A final benefit is that physical death dissolves our sin-corrupted bodies so that they can be refashioned in the resurrection. St. Paul describes this by a metaphor of a seed that's planted. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, you have this quote in your handout. He says, "What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body which is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as He has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body." What he's talking about here, and the terminology is maybe foreign to us, but what he's saying is, when you plant a seed in the ground, what happens to that seed? Well, it gets wet, and it starts to decay a little bit. It starts to, like the outer shell of it will kind of start to decay so that what's inside of it can grow and sprout from the decay. And as the plant grows out of the seed, what grows out of the seed doesn't at all look like the seed, right? They look different. But everything that grows out of the seed was present sort of in potential form in the seed. It's not that the plant and the seed are a different entity, but the seed has become what it had potential to be. Okay? So that's what he's talking about in terms of the vegetable world, and he's using that as a metaphor to describe what happens with our bodies after death and in the general resurrection. He says, so is it with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown, what is planted is perishable. It decays. But what is raised, what grows out of that seed, is imperishable. It is planted or sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. Now we're going to talk more about the resurrection of the dead and what that means in session 3. But I pointed out here as being an example of decay being of benefit, because he says the seed cannot grow into the plant it's meant to be unless it is planted in the ground and begins to decay. Now some of the saints use a little different metaphor. They speak of the body like a statue. Like imagine that there's a statue, let's say a bronze statue, and it's been sitting out exposed for a long, long time, and vandals have come and they've defaced it, and maybe they've torn pieces off of it. Maybe the rain and the elements and acid rain and whatever has corrupted or corroded the metal that the statue is made out of. Well, the saints will say, if someone wants to remake that body and turn it into what it was meant to be, what it was originally created to be, what they do is they take the metal and they melt it down. They put it in a crucible. They refine it in fire. And through that refining process, then they're able to form a new statue, to pour the metal into a new form and create a new statue, the same or maybe even better than the original form of the statue. And so in that sense, they talk about the earth that receives the body of the deceased as being like that crucible that reduces the body down to the original elements from which it is made, so that then it can be refashioned in the form that God intends in the resurrection. And St. John Chrysostom uses another metaphor, the same sort of theme, but from a different perspective. He says, imagine that the body is like a rental house. Janet's sitting right here. I live in her rental house. So I'll use myself as an example of this. So St. John Chrysostom says, what if Father Jeremy in Jen's house has wild parties every weekend and tears it up, and, there's splattered paint and feces and whatever on the wall, and people have thrown up in the corners, and it's just, yeah. And so, but he says, imagine that Jan is a really, really, really good-hearted landlady, which she is. And what if Jan says, look, you've ruined your house. I'm going to move you out of your house, and I'm going to put you up in a hotel while we just gut this house and rebuild it, and then you can move back in. St. John Chrysostom says that's what it's like where God is the landlord, okay? The body is the house, and the soul is the renters or the tenants in the house. So we have trashed our house, we've corrupted our body, and in death, God moves us out of our house so that He can fix it up and move us back in the general resurrection. All right. We're running a little bit behind. I'm going to try to push on through because we have a lot of material. I'm going to try to keep it brief. It is 9 o'clock. Those of you who have to leave, I understand, but we're going to try to push through. So, these are the benefits that God foresees being able to bring through death. But all of this is possible. This salvation that we envision is possible only because the Son of God became a man, died on the cross, a sinless death, after leading a sinless life, and so saved us from the power of sin and death through His resurrection. And this mystery of the cross, which is at the heart of the Christian faith, is deep and expansive in its meaning. It can be considered from many, many different points of view. But today we're going to consider just one aspect of that, especially as it relates to the subject of death and the afterlife. So Christ, through His sinless death on the cross, destroyed the power of death. And that's what we celebrate on Pascha, right? Christ has risen from the dead, trampling down death by death and trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. And it's pictured in the icon of the resurrection, which you might be able to see, but I can't. That's in the apse there, of Christ standing victorious, raising Adam and Eve from the dead, and what's beneath His feet but the bound figure of death. So Christ has defeated death, saved us from death through His sinless death on the cross. St. Paul talks about that in his epistle to the Hebrews. He says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood," and by the children he means us, the children of Adam, "he himself likewise partook of the same nature," and the he he's speaking of is Christ, the Son of God who became a man, joined us in the human race. He himself likewise partook of the same nature, that through death he might destroy him who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong bondage. So Christ destroyed the power of death by invading its territory. And that's what we especially see in that icon. Christ, his soul, after it was separated from his body, descending into the realm of the dead, Hades, breaking down its doors. And you see the bronze doors of Hades underneath his feet, and liberating those who were held captive there. Christ in this task was uniquely qualified to do this. And he was uniquely qualified because in his person was combined both human nature and divine nature. He was both God and man. He who was God from all eternity, he takes on human nature, he becomes a man. And so he shares both our human life as well as God's divine life. That union of those two natures was providential and really was the only way to save us from this downward spiral that the human race was enthralled with. Because only as a man could Christ enter into the experience of death, right? God is immortal by nature, so he's separated from death. He has no experience of death, and he, in a way, death is foreign to him. So Christ becoming a man, the Son of God becoming a man, is able to come to grips with death. But then, as God and as remaining God, he has the power of essential life within him, right? We talked about this, how God is a source of life. We have the potential to receive that life and to enjoy that life, but we don't create that life. God is the life creator. And so Jesus Christ, as the Son of God, as truly God, is a life creator. He generates life. So he combines the mortal with the essential immortal. He combines life with the experience of death. He brings essential life, divine life, into the very pit of death. And thereby he destroys death. Utterly destroys death. St. John Chrysostom and several of the other saints talk about this act of Christ's soul descending into Hades like a bitter pill that death was made to swallow. So death, in finding Christ, and you can read the quote from St. John Chrysostom on your own, but I'll just summarize for you since we're out of time. Jesus Christ, he had the form of a man, and when he died, death received him happily. Just as it hungrily received all of those mortal men who, after a life of on earth, have died and entered into its realm. But it did not see the invisible reality that was attached to that visible reality. It did not see that this man was not like every other man, but was also God. And so, having received this, what it thought to be a man, it found within itself God. And not just a generator of life, but a generator of life who, through his sinless human life, had fashioned a soul which death had no claim on. So that's the other aspect of it. Christ as God brings divine life into death and destroys death. But also Christ has fashioned this sinless human life that death has no claim on. The wages of sin is death. Christ did not sin, and therefore Christ did not deserve death. Among all human beings, among all adult human beings, Christ, through his sinless life, positively deserved life, and yet he received instead death. And so when death receives within itself divine life, when it receives this sinless soul, the whole sin and death system, which had been running for so long, is exploded. It's blown apart. Sin leading to death, the fear of death, the reality of death, prompting people to sin, that is all destroyed. And Christ creates he pioneers a new path for us to follow in the resurrection. There's a hymn from the canon of Holy Saturday that describes this, and you have it in your handout. And it's addressing Christ. It says, "O Lord, through your death, you changed our mortality into immortality. For in a way that is appropriate only to God, you render the mortal human race an immortal one by giving immortality to the body, which your divine nature received. For your all-holy body, Lord, did succumb to the separation and the distance from the soul. His body was separated from the soul in death, but it did not experience decomposition and annihilation. Your all-pure soul, having descended into Hades, did not remain there as the souls of all other men, since neither your soul was abandoned in Hades, nor your body experienced corruption. They were both reunited and resurrected. Therefore, that which you received in your humanity was immortalized. Consequently, Adam too, and all of human nature, was immortalized." It's 9:10, so we're going to continue with this next week. Thank you for your patience and for bearing with me. And any questions that you have, I think probably save them for next week. Write them down and bring them with you. Thanks.